I'm David Wisner, the Executive Director of the Dukakis Center at the American College of Thessaloniki, the post-secondary division at Anatolia College. This is our first public event in the 2020-2021 academic year. And we're just coming off the celebration of our 20th anniversary season at the Dukakis Center, which we had to curtail this past spring owing to the outbreak of COVID-19 in Greece and around the world. We are speaking on the subject this evening of the 2020 US general election. And I'd just like to announce that we're in the process of planning an event, a post-election event with our partner in Athens, Eliameb. This will be another webinar, which we will host in late November once the final results have been made public. Our speaker this evening is Charles Stewart, Professor of Political Science at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's a resident expert in American politics. This is actually Professor Stewart's third time speaking at the Dukakis Center. We actually hosted a webinar before webinars were a thing back in October 2016 for a public audience at the US Consulate General of Thessaloniki. This evening, we're obliged by circumstance to welcome you only remotely via Zoom, but we're thankful that you are here in attendance with us now. I want to say this is in general one of a long series of Dukakis Center public service initiatives. We began discussing and covering elections in the United States in October of 2000, when our then resident public service chair, Eugene Skolnikov of MIT, gave a lecture and participated in a roundtable on foreign policy and electoral politics in the United States. This is a webinar, so allow me just to remind those of you who are not accustomed to using this platform that if you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the QA function and write your question down. I'll be moderating along with my technical assistant this evening, Marina Haritopoulou, and we will try to ask as many of your questions as we can get to. And I'm very happy to thank Ms. Haritopoulou for her technical assistance this evening. Well, here we are, here to set the stage before I turn the floor over to our speaker. This is a line I read recently in a report by the Pew Research Center, according to which it is difficult to recall an election in which the public has had such a wide array of concerns about the election process and its outcome. Well, Professor Stewart just today called it a breathless parlor game, the endless series of speculations about what scenarios we might face on the day after the election. And now he is here with us live to give us an expert opinion about what we're going through, what is happening in 2020. Professor Stewart, Charles, welcome to the Dukakis Center. You have the floor.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be at the Dukakis Center again, third time, virtually. Next time, let's hope it's in person. In fact, as David knows, my desire actually originally before the pandemic hit was to actually come to Thessaloniki with my wife last spring, but alas, that was not to be. So as they say, maybe next year in Thessaloniki. So I'm gonna, let's see, share my screen here and say a few words about the election that's coming up, and I will rely on David to let me know if there's any problems with the slides.
Okay,
so,
it looks good so far.
Thanks. So I'm always, whenever I'm talking to a non-American audience, I'm always aware that, people in Greece are much more aware of American politics than many Americans are. And so I don't want to assume too little, but I also don't want to assume too much. And so what I thought I would do is I would just start with some basic background about how the national election is going to be run, say some words about what I see as the likely outcome and why I think that outcome is likely to happen. Say some words about the struggles that Americans have had in voting, and how and then how what the days after the election are likely to look like, not just based on the outcome of the election per se, but on what might be disruptions in the process afterwards. So I will just start by illustrating, I think, probably the most important, well, either the most or the second most important aspect of this election. And that has to do with the political polarization that's in the United States. And this would be a condition of this election, whether or not we were voting amid COVID, and quite frankly, whether or not we had the current incumbent in the White House. That American politics has become much more polarized around region, around class, somewhat around age, race rather, over the last 20 years. And actually, in some ways, it's become more classically European in the sense that one of those divisions is increasingly becoming between rural areas and the cities, and with the Republican Party almost becoming essentially a Christian Democratic Party, and much like Christian Democratic parties in Europe, and the Democratic Party becoming a combination of a liberal, social democratic, more secular ruling mid-left party. This graph illustrates the divisions, which just shows political scientists for many, many years have been asking people how they feel about the political party they affiliate with and how they feel about the political party in the opposition. And increasingly over the last 20 years, people have continued to like their own party, but importantly, they've come to hate the other party. And that's just, as I said, that's just something to put out there. And I think that's a I wouldn't say a permanent feature of American politics, but I think it is a persistent feature of American politics that is going to govern how we rule ourselves and run our elections for many, many years to come. The second challenge, of course, is voting during the pandemic. We've already had one round of voting, the preliminary or primary season, which ran from March until the end of the summer, where we most notably chose the nominees for the two major parties. At the level below the federal level, the national level, the states and localities also were choosing nominees at lower levels as well. So there were elections nationwide that rolled throughout the country from March through the end of the summer. And these were challenging, but I have to say that the silver lining here is that the United States actually got some practice with voting amidst the pandemic. And to kind of summarize a lot of that's happened over the last 7 months, we've done two things. One, figured out how to move many more people to voting by mail, to do postal voting. It's looking like about half of Americans will vote by mail, and I'll say a few words about that. Among those who will vote in person, about half will vote actually in person before Election Day, meaning that on Election Day itself, which is now less than 2 weeks away, 12 days from today, that will only be about a third to a quarter of the electorate will actually vote on that day. One little bit of shameless selling here. I have been running a project, and I'll just encourage you to visit the website after the talk is over. If you go to healthyelections.org, I have been running a large operation, the most prominent academic, both study and implementation program around voting amidst COVID. If this were the typical talk I was giving in the United States, I would spend 10 minutes talking about this project. I won't do that here, but I'd encourage you to go to the website to find out a lot of research related to what has happened in the States and related to issues around voting by mail, voting in person, voting to maintain social distancing and those sorts of things. So let me dive into the talk. And the place I will start, again, I know many of you all know this, but many of you do not know this. And so I'll just start with a basic that we cover in my introductory American politics class when I teach. And that is, while the American election, presidential election, looks like a national election to win the popular vote, and it's looked like that for almost 200 years, in fact, the United States presidential election is determined by votes in something that's called the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College is an organization in our Constitution. Electors in the Electoral College actually cast the ballots for president. The electors do not meet in a single place, but they do meet in the state capitals of all the states, the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, which gets votes. On the left here, you will see a map of the United States and the states. It's probably, you've seen this map many times before. This is the real map. On the right is a map of the United States that which all the states are in proportion to the number of votes they have in the college. A state gets as many votes as they have members of the United States Congress, both the lower house of representatives and the upper house, the Senate. So you'll see large population states such as California, New York, Texas, Florida will get the most votes. You will see by how the map is distorted when the states are proportional to population, that the great population locations are on the two coasts, in the east and the west, and in the southeast. And I'll come back to that in just a second. Where the interior of the country, particularly, the Great West, the site of all the Westerns, et cetera, great spaces, spectacular spaces, no people. And so they get very few votes. So there are three important facts of the Electoral College. First of all, there's 538 votes. It takes a majority to win the presidency. That's 270. Mm-hmm. And almost every state allocates their votes on a winner-take-all basis. There's an important consequence for this last fact, and that means that for states that are safely in one, basically safely, we know will ahead of time will give majorities to one party or the other. There's not a whole lot of campaigning goes on in those states, and that the campaign really focuses on the states where there's a chance for either party to win, and in particular in the closest of states. So Americans, when we go to a number of news sites, we will see graphs like this. This is from the website 538.com. You will see that number again, 538, number of electoral votes. This is their snake diagram, which orders all of the states, the reddest at the top being the most Republican. The reddest state is Wyoming, one of those little, small population, big area states out west. And then on the other end, it was the most Democratic states. Actually, the most Democratic voting unit is the District of Columbia. Massachusetts, where I live, is the most Democratic of the states. That's the bluest. And in the middle are, lighter shades of blue and red based on how close these states are. So we can array all of these states about how Democratic or Republican they are. And then we discover, for instance, that when you line them up and you count up the votes, it's the state of Pennsylvania that is likely to determine who the president is going to be. And you can look at the states around Pennsylvania and you see other states close by, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, Florida, that are also what's known as battleground states. So this is a map that points out the battleground states. And this is really where the campaigning is happening. I failed to post up a map of where the candidates are visiting, but if I had done that, it almost perfectly matches the battleground states, where they're buying television ads. Almost perfectly matches the battleground states. The only reason in Massachusetts we get any advertisement or people, well, only reason we get any advertisement in Boston is that if you can buy television time in Boston, it actually gets broadcast into New Hampshire, which is one of these states. We also get visited by candidates because we have a lot of rich Democrats in Boston, and they will campaign fundraise. But there's two sets of states here that I would point out, which is also, giving a certain flavor to this election. There's one set of battleground states in what's known as the Rust Belt. These are northern states. It's the deindustrializing region of the United States, where automobile manufacturing, steel manufacturing, a bit of coal mining, traditional industrial areas that no longer are as strong as they used to be, losing population, losing political strength. Importantly, and this I think goes to the appeal of Donald Trump, this is also the area that has had the fastest rise in recent rise in racial polarization, and I would say white nationalism in the United States in this area, probably driven by the effects of deindustrialization and dissatisfaction about what's happening in the economy in many of these places. On the other side, we have the battleground states in the area that's known as the Sun Belt. Southern, the weather is nicer in the winter. These are areas that are friendlier to business, where a lot of businesses have moved over the last 50 years, where a lot of the population has moved over the last 50 years. States like Florida, Texas, Arizona, where the population has moved. For about the last 30 years or so, this has been a very conservative area. As I mentioned, it's been very pro-business. Republicans have been very strong in most of these states. Interestingly enough, though, as the economy in the South has risen, and as immigration from Latin America, Central America, and South America has risen also in this region, this area has actually become much more competitive. And so if you've been following politics in the United States, or even if you haven't, the interesting thing about this election is the Sun Belt, these battleground states in the South, would normally be Republican, typically, but they're becoming increasingly Democratic because of demographic changes. The battleground states in the North are traditionally Democratic. And Donald Trump won in 2016 because he was able to win 3 of them, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And it's those states that will determine the outcome this time. But the fact, and I'll touch on this in just a second, the fact that this election probably will not be as close as maybe it should be, is going to be because of the political realignment and changes actually in the southern battleground states. So we have the 2 candidates, Donald Trump, the incumbent, Joe Biden, who is Barack Obama's vice president, the candidate of the Democrats. Who's going to win? Well, to preface this, I will bring up something that's very common in political science. And this is view of the electorate as the rational god of vengeance and reward. This is a phrase that was coined by the political scientist V.O. Key back in the 1960s, who pointed out that voters are not very informed about the issues or even the candidates. What they are most informed about is, how has the economy done recently? How has society been recently? And whether justly or unjustly, they tend to punish or reward the incumbent president, whom they either credit or blame with how things are going right now. And it's this retrospective evaluation that drives so much of American politics. And so I'm going to be talking about Donald Trump and the problems he's having, not because I'm particularly anti-Trump, but simply because he is the incumbent. And it's his, and in any American election, if an incumbent is running for re-election, it's the incumbent's performance that dominates where we're going. So how popular is Donald Trump? Not very popular. This graph shows the average of all of the public opinion polls that have been taken during his presidency, where different pollsters have asked, do you support Donald Trump or do you not support Donald Trump? The orange line is the percentage of people on average who've said they disapprove. The green line is the percentage who said they approve. Right now, Donald Trump is, as they say, underwater. Only about 42%, 43% say they approve. Donald Trump, if we compare his polls against every other president since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, when these polls started, Donald Trump is the only president whose average in the approval polls has never been above 50%. And right now, his approval is where other presidents who lost re-election was at the time. For instance, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, Jimmy Carter, both lost re-election with popularity or approval around where Donald Trump is right now. And his Donald Trump's disapproval is pretty much across the board in almost every policy area, except perhaps the economy. Trump is given credit among independents and a few Democrats with continuing the growth that had started under President Obama. But if you look in every other area, this is from the Gallup poll, which is the most I would say distinguished and oldest pollster in the United States, who regularly asks people not only do they approve of Donald Trump, but do they approve of him in various issue domains. And as you can see, in foreign policy, in response to the coronavirus, race relations, relations with China, and crime, more people disapprove than approve. And if you look at the time series of his approval on just coronavirus alone, the disapproval numbers have been were rising throughout the spring and the summer. And they have been around almost 60% disapproval for the last several months. So where are we with the election then? So to come back to the Electoral College, now Donald Trump, it's a diverse country. And so there are pockets of Trump support and opposition. Here is a map from The Economist. They have also a modeling page that's very, very good. Actually, this is the one I prefer over 538 for technical reasons. But this gives you a sense about, you can go there, you can see where the different states are right now. And I would just point out that the states I mentioned previously that gave the presidency to Donald Trump in 2016 right now are colored blue, indicating that the polls in those states are indicating that Joe Biden is likely to win. That is Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Furthermore, some Sunbelt states that are have typically been Republican, but are in the middle, sometimes we call them the purple states, North Carolina and Florida, are likely to go to Biden. In addition, Georgia right now, which is right now colored white, which has been pretty strongly Republican for about the last 20 years, right now is giving a little bit of an edge to Biden. Iowa, which is the heart of rural farmer country in the United States, is right now giving it a little tad to Donald Trump, which is a bad sign for Donald Trump. Likewise, Texas, while it's right now looking like it's going to go for Trump, it should be dark red, not light red. So, and then if we look at the economist predictions about where the Electoral College would be if voting were today, their model says that it would be Biden 44 to 194. And this would be similar to the victory that Barack Obama had over John McCain in the 2008 election. So this is not a landslide, but it's would be a comfortable victory. So that's where we are with respect to the politics. Let me just say a little bit about voting. As I mentioned in the introduction, the big election administration project over the last 7 months has been to rearrange voting in the United States to enforce social distancing in polling places and to encourage people to vote by mail or to vote early in person. And I'm just showing you this graph, which I use a lot in my talks when I give public talks, just shows the percentages by which Americans have been voting by mail over the last 20 years. And in the election of 2016, about 60% of Americans voted on election day, about 20% voted by mail, and about 20% voted early. My guess is that when I redo this graph after the election, it's going to look like this, with a much larger number of people, maybe half voting by mail, and about the remainder voting on election day are voting early. As of this morning, 84 million people have received a mail ballot. That's over half of the people we expect to vote in this election. It'll be about 150 million people. So most voters now actually have a ballot in their hands that they could return by mail or walk in if they, yes, David has his, and I think he's going to talk about it. Already, 38 million people have voted, either by mail or in person. So the election is going on. And I could talk for a long time about this, I won't, but it's been very difficult and there will still be some rocky stretches ahead, but actually election administration, which happens at the state and local level here, has been amazingly resilient and moving to this new model. So I'll just end here, maybe with a bit of a less optimistic view. The pivot to voting by mail has been successful. Americans are very energized about this election. They are going to the polls, even as we're now getting the second wave, and actually the second wave of the coronavirus will be worse than the first. When the first voting happened as well, Americans are voting, and they're eagerly voting. There's been a lot in the press in the last few weeks speculating about whether Donald Trump, if he were to lose, would go peacefully. Famously was refusing to say he would endorse a peaceful transfer of power. In fairness, a couple of days ago, he finally came out and said, of course he would. And so there's no doubt there. Nonetheless, the prospect, first of all, that he might resist leaving office should he lose, has worried a number of people. There's also another thing, which is likely to, which is a little more true, although I'm less inclined to go down this path as well. With the rise of mail ballots, it's probably going to take Americans much longer to count those ballots than in the past. Americans are used to the Associated Press and the other national networks declaring who the victor is on election night based on the election returns that have come in, the ballots that have been counted. If it's going to take longer to count ballots, if Donald Trump supporters are more likely to vote on election day, which is probably going to be true, and if Joe Biden supporters are more likely to vote early, which is also likely to be true, then it may be that the election night results are going to be very different, or the votes that are counted on election day as the polls close, those results may be very different than what we observe a week or two later, or even a month later, when the states stop counting all of the ballots. And that may give rise to charges unsubstantiated of fraud, and also may give rise to legal action as well. And so one of the things that we are bracing for is perhaps some social disruption during the counting period. So with that, I will thank you for your time. I will turn it back over to David, and I look forward to the questions when it comes to that time in the event. So back to you, David.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for that very concise and informative presentation. I cited you, or I sort of put together a few things that I read from your article and the public radio in Boston the other day, according to which you call it a parlor game. To what extent are we really talking about overblown speculation? And to what extent are we talking about things that might actually happen? So the fears that we have, the red mirage and the blue wave, or whatever they're calling it, and the legal action that might be taken. You know, we've been speculating about this, that I recall, since 2004. There were all kinds of articles about what John Kerry was going to do to contest should Bush be declared the victor. To what extent is it realistic to think we might see one of these scenarios unfold?
I think there are three scenarios for election day and forward. The most likely one, and I'd say this is greater than 50%, is that on election night, if the current polls hold, then on election night, we actually will have enough information on election night to have a clear sense about what I'm calling the path to 270. And that is to say, your home state, Florida, my former home state, Florida, they will be probably able to count all of their votes by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And so we will know, I'm pretty certain, by then which way Florida goes and whether it's going to be taken by Biden or not. If Biden wins Florida, given how we know support doesn't shift uniformly across the country, but it's pretty close to a uniform, what's called a uniform swing. Okay. And so if Biden wins Florida, then that means that he's shifted Democratic sentiments in Florida by at least 6 points, maybe 8 points. And so that means that the states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, that were so critical in 2016, we're sure that those states will go to Trump. And pretty much the game is over. Now, the question is going to arise about how quickly the ballots can be counted. So that the networks in the United States may be slower in projecting a winner of particular states, and therefore may be slower in projecting that Biden has gotten to 270, is pretty much assured of 270 votes on election night. But if we know that where Florida is going, and there's a number of other states that will be counting their ballots very quickly, and if they're all consistent with a shift of even 2 to 3 points compared to 2016, then it's going to be clear where things are going to go.
So this is what you mean, how wide or how broad the path is.
Exactly, how broad or wide. And so right now, my bet is that I'm betting on the networks declaring a likely victor by the time the sun comes up on Wednesday morning.
Okay.
So, but there are other scenarios. For instance, if Florida is too close to call, or even if it's close for for Trump, then we will have to wait to see what these other states are what's happening in North Carolina and a few other states that we think may flip from Trump to Biden. In that case, it may very well be that we don't know until Wednesday, Thursday. And then, of course, there's the final scenario in which it's basically 2016 repeated.
Okay.
Which again is highly unlikely given the polls. But if it's 2016 repeated, that's the one where not only will it take a long time, I think, to get the votes counted, but that's the one where Donald Trump's legal team will pull out all the stops.
Okay.
And where I think we're the most worried that their social unrest would not only amount to protests, but efforts actually to stop the counting of votes in order to preserve what may very well be a lead that Trump holds among the votes that are counted first.
Okay.
And so that's the thing that we're worried about. I would put like a 5% probability on that last scenario.
Okay.
But maybe 10. But it's one that we've been wargaming about, and is, I would say, the one that's the highest risk of a constitutional crisis, because it will reveal how antiquated our Constitution is when it comes to naming a president, electing a president, and how poorly drafted the laws are about resolving disputes in the Electoral College. And that's what we were worried about in 2000. And that's, as you said, in 2004, Kerry was planning for.
There was a lot of speculation in the media, and the media are driving this, aren't they?
They are, although, it's interesting. I think that the responsible national media have been thinking hard. In fact, I know they've been thinking hard about how to report on this election. And I think you will see, for one thing, if you're going to be following, watching American media on election night, like CNN particularly, traditionally they would report the percentage of precincts reporting. Now they're going to be reporting the percentage of expected vote that has been counted. And they're going to be much more transparent about
circumspect. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Much more circumspect and much more transparent about the judgments that they're making, because they recognize that this is a different election. And they also recognize that there's a fine line to walk here, so that they give the information they need and people aren't misled. But they don't want to be overly kind of called states too early, because that could cause very much cause problems.
Okay, you're answering some of the questions that are being put in the Q&A, so I'm going to fold two together with an observation. You expressed great faith in the election administration professionals whose job it is to administer the site and then to count the votes. And we have not unrelated questions from two of our acquaintances and friends and colleagues from Democrats abroad, Greece. First, we have Karen Lee asking to what extent the previous problems that we faced, such as the lack of paper trails, possible hacking of election software, have been corrected thus far. And then Peter Bader is asking, which of the swing states are going to have the greatest difficulty reporting their results and take the greatest amount of time? So the sort of some of the technical problems in actually counting the vote, and who's going to delay the most among the swing states.
Right, those are two good questions. First, to Karen's question about the electronic voting machines, those are the DREs. Only about a much smaller number of votes in 2020 will be counted on those electronic machines than in 2016. At one point, we thought we would actually get rid of all the electronic machines for 2020, but we haven't. So about 10% of votes will be on the electronic machines this time. Now, luckily, two battleground states, one of them being Pennsylvania, one of them being Georgia, which used a lot of the paperless machines, have gotten rid of the paperless machines. So they will have paper ballots that can be counted by hand if there's a recount in those states. And so, and I'm confident that by 2024 we'll be done with all of the paperless machines. So we do have to endure them a little bit. They may be an issue in some states that are not battleground states, like Louisiana and Indiana. Still, with respect to the swing states that I'm most worried about in terms of slow counting, the one state that I'm most worried about is Pennsylvania, to cut to the chase. And the reason is the following. It's not for the reason that's most commonly expressed in the press. The reason that's most commonly expressed in the press is that Pennsylvania, its law says that when you mail in a ballot, the election authority is not allowed to begin processing that ballot until election day. And by processing, it's meant checking your name off the voter roll, comparing the signature with the signature on file, taking the ballot out of the envelope, even all that's before you even count. Most states allow you to do all those things before election day. Pennsylvania doesn't. And a number of people have been worried that it's going to take so long to do all those clerical acts that it might be days before Pennsylvania even begins counting the mail ballots. Now, the thing that worries me is not so much that, because Pennsylvania, I mean, there are ways, I mean, they have recruited thousands of people to deal with this logistical challenge on election day. And I think a lot of ballots can be counted on election day that come in by mail. Pennsylvania, though, has a highly partisan system of election administration. And it's at the county level and it's at the precinct level. Well, where there is in tandem a Democrat and a Republican that preside jointly over county election apparatus and every precinct polling station apparatus. It's also the case that Pennsylvania has a pretty broad statute that allows people to challenge whether or not a mail ballot has been properly cast.
Okay.
And so, and there is a history in Pennsylvania of basically frivolous challenges to mail ballots. And so the worry becomes seeing literally every mail ballot in the city of Philadelphia challenged by the Trump campaign. And if that's allowed to proceed, then Pennsylvania's count conceivably could take weeks, if not months, to accomplish. I don't have time to talk about the details of it here, but okay. I actually mentioned this. I mean, you've made reference to the blog post yesterday at the WBUR site here in Boston, but I actually think that the courts would not put up with that. Okay. But nonetheless, I think that Pennsylvania is the place where challenges to ballots could make things go longer. Michigan and Wisconsin, which have been talked about in the press, my spies in those states have assured me, I've talked a lot to election officials, the press in those states. I think Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Milwaukee's going to take a long time to count, but they'll probably be done by noon on Wednesday. Okay. And Detroit is going to take a long time to count, but they've taken over the large basketball arena in Detroit, and they're going to be handling the mail ballots there.
So all these articles that speculate that Nancy Pelosi will be president, if they're, that's quite unlikely.
That's quite unlikely that Nancy Pelosi is going to be president, at least this time around.
Okay, we have several questions. I'll mention one person by name, Stacey Harris Papayuano, with whom we collaborated when the Dukakis Center hosted the Global Democratic Presidential Primary back in the spring, is asking about polls and what is it that would lead you today, looking at the polls, to think that Joe Biden has a better chance than Hillary Clinton had in 2016 of winning, because in some ways the numbers are similar. What's happening that would give us more confidence in the polls? This is a question that several of our viewers are asking.
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's a big difference between 2020 and 2016, and that has to do with the fact that Americans are firm in their opinions about Donald Trump in 2020, whereas they were not firm in their opinions about either Trump or Clinton in 2016.
Okay.
And that could lead to the sort of volatility that we saw in 2016. We've seen already, for instance, events that during the campaign that in any other year would have moved the numbers significantly. For instance, Donald Trump getting COVID.
Okay.
Any other year, that would have elicited at least a bit of a sympathy vote. Either a sympathy vote or, people might have said, okay, well, there's another thing that he's done.
Okay.
And it didn't go down either. Basically, his numbers stayed unchanged. And so,
okay.
So I think, and again, because of this, God of revenge, of vengeance and reward, the public is really judging Donald Trump, and they have very strong opinions about Donald Trump. They did not have strong opinions about Donald Trump or about Hillary Clinton in 2016, and therefore opinions can move, or at least among a certain segment of the electorate, they can move faster. They can't move.
Okay.
They're not going to move fast right now.
Okay, that's really good then. Fotini Evstratiadou sends her greetings. She and I welcomed you to our home a couple years ago when you visited, and I can't wait to see you back in Greece. I have to say, if there's something we could do to grease the skids and get you here, well, just let me know. I have a few more questions if you have the time. Fotini's questions maybe is a question of political sociology. To what extent is there a Greek American voting bloc, might you say, or would there be anything that would be of interest to you as a student of healthy elections that would lead you to consider what one ethnicity or another ethnicity, what one voting group might do? We're particularly interested here, and I speak for everybody who's watching, at how the outcome of the election will impact Greek affairs and how Greek-American relations will fare as a result. We're also interested in how Greek Americans are relating to the current campaign. If you had anything to say about that, that would certainly buy you another ticket back to Greece.
Well, I think in terms of Greek Americans as a voting bloc, so Greece is not like Ireland in the sense that there are more Irish in America than there are in Ireland. I think there are more Greeks in Greece than there are in the United States, and so the Greek voting bloc is not very large in the United States, it's more Democratic than not, but only weakly so. Greek Americans are fully integrated into American politics and tend to come down according to what their social class is and where they live, et cetera. Michael Dukakis, for instance, son of immigrants, living in an area that's very liberal, very progressive. He reflects the politics that he grew up with. And for Greek Americans, that's very much very much integrated into the United States. I think if anything, I mean, Greek Americans are relatively new. I mean, are not a brand new minority in the United States, ethnic group, but you know, Greek American. I mean, that community is about a century old, if you will, and so middle aged. It's not old, it's not young. It's a middle aged ethnic group in the United States, and people of kind of European background. You know, they knew grandparents and who or knew of grandparents who came from Europe. And I do think that Donald Trump and his opposition to immigration has caused a number of people who are, you know, even if they're second and third generation, nonetheless are kind of close enough to the immigration moment to recoil a bit from Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And so I think, and that's true, I mean, as well among basically groups that would have gone through Ellis Island, for instance, particularly. So groups that are pretty much assimilated, but nonetheless, you know, have family, know of grandparents, et cetera. I think that the thing that may be the most consequential is just that a Biden administration, I think, is going to reflect much more of a traditional American internationalist foreign policy.
Okay. All right.
And so, and we know, I mean, Donald Trump has been famously not internationalist and famously not particularly kind toward our traditional allies. And so I think we can very quickly see a Biden administration reestablish strong ties with NATO, with the European community, to be much firmer in dealing with Russia, and essentially following the foreign policy of Barack Obama and his predecessors. Now, the world has changed in the last 4 years, and so there are some facts on the ground that are different. You know, the Iran deal has been scuttled, et cetera. The climate, you know, America has pulled out of the climate change agreement, et cetera. So there are some things that will need to be patched up, and the patching up, you know, the world is different now, and so it's going to take a while to achieve that reconnection with the world. But I do think that you know, Greece, you know, being in an strategically important part of the world, is probably going to be paid much more attention by a Biden administration, and certainly NATO members, European people who are, you know, countries integrated into Europe, are going to be, you know, much more friendly, treated friendly by a Biden administration.
Okay, great. I want to mention that we're getting a couple comments on the chat. I don't know if you have access to the chat at your end, but some people are maybe taking issue with some of your opinion about Greek Americans immigration. So I'd invite you to take a look at that.
Yep.
I'm getting some incredibly interesting questions. I have one posed by a trustee of Anatolia College, David Weil, who would like you to explain which constitutional issue might likely arise and how one thinks it could be resolved. In other words, you alluded to this at one point in your presentation, I think toward the end. There are certain worries that we have a constitutional issue, it becomes a bit of a crisis. What would that issue be, in your opinion, and how might it be resolved?
The constitutional issues that are talked about are those in which a state either fails to elect a slate of electors to the Electoral College, or there are competing slates of electors. So the failure to elect would be something like this. Imagine that scenario I proffered that has Pennsylvania taking months to determine who won the election. Well, the Electoral College is meeting on December, I believe it's the 15th. It's in the middle of December. And by the Constitution, all of the Electoral College members have to meet on the same day in the state legislatures to vote. So if there is not a slate of electors, let's say, you know, Pennsylvania for this counterfactual, then Pennsylvania doesn't send votes on to Congress to be counted when Congress counts those votes at the beginning of January. So one of the issues that comes up is, well, let's say it's really, really close. And because Pennsylvania, under the scenario, hasn't cast electoral votes, it's possible that neither candidate gets 270 electoral votes. There is a constitutional question.
Okay.
Do you need a majority of all the electoral votes, or do you need a majority of those cast?
Okay.
So that's one of them. Another one is you can have a scenario in which there are competing slates of electors meeting in the state capitol. And this happened in the election of 1876, which is the most famous example in American history. And Congress could be called on to adjudicate between competing electors. There is a law which mandates which set of electors Congress should credit, but would Congress follow through on the law? And if they didn't, who would adjudicate that?
Okay.
It's not clear if the Supreme Court would have a role, et cetera. So, but it's really about disputes about who the electors are, whether we know who they are, or if enough have been elected.
Okay. Let me ask two last questions. One is derived from one of our audience members. Then what percentage of the eligible voting population is going to vote this year? What kind of voting turnout are you looking at? I mean, it's going to be what we consider to be good year, around 65%. Will it be more? Will it be less? Is one able to judge at this time?
I'm betting that it's going to be high. In fact, I'm betting it's going to be the highest on a percentage terms since the election of 1900.
Wow.
And part of that is the midterm congressional election of 2018
Okay.
was the highest that sort of election has been since the early part of the 20th century as well. So there's a real good chance this will be historically high turnout.
That's a lot of ballots to count.
Indeed. And that's why 150 million people that I mentioned earlier would be reflective of a historic rate of turnout in the United States.
And now this is my question, and it has to do also with the ballot. My ballot is 5 pages long. So you remind our audience that we're not only voting for the President of the United States, we're voting for other officers in the federal government, for the Senate and for the House of Representatives. We're voting for various people in the state government, local government. We have amendments to constitutions. We have initiatives that are put on the ballot by Citizen Action. We have all kinds of things going on. In the state of Florida, we're talking about introducing what we call a jungle primary. That is, say, a primary that's not controlled by the political parties and which is open to any voter who wishes to participate. That would wreak havoc, and I'm guessing that the parties don't like that idea. But I'm curious, as you look at down ballot items, what are the sorts of things that you're picking up? What looks to be really interesting in your eyes?
Indeed. And actually, I would also imagine that ballot is 5 pages long. It may very well be bilingual or multilingual as well.
Yes, it's in Spanish also.
And so that will add to the length. Down ballot, and well, as you mentioned, a good number of state governors, almost every state legislature, and many local governments, and these citizen questions are on the ballot, which is another thing going to be driving turnout. One of the things that I'd say that there are two sets of races that political junkies like myself are following. The first is the elections for the United States Senate. As you know, 1/3 of the United States Senate is up for election every 2 years. And right now it's controlled very narrowly by the Republican Party. One consequence of Donald Trump's political problems is that the Republican candidates for the Senate are also in trouble. Indeed, they appear to be in more trouble than he is. And so if you go to the Economist site or the 538 sites right now, you will see, or even the betting sites, you will see that the Democrats are favored to win control of the Senate. And that's actually what I'll be watching and watching even more carefully on election night. And actually, I think that is the election that is going to be at the federal level, national level, that's going to be the longest to resolve rather than the presidency. Even down below that, and I'll wrap it up quickly, state legislatures. And the reason why state legislatures are important is for a couple of, the big reason is we've just finished our census.
Right.
That census is going to, lead to a bit of a revision of the apportionment of representation in Congress among the states. The states are going to have to redraw their legislative lines to make them of equal population. And it's the state legislatures in most states that draw these lines. We know in the US, there's a tendency for if a party has what's known as a trifecta, if they control both chambers of a state legislature and the governor, they will draw districts that favor that party. And right now, there's a lot of interest in the control of governorships and state legislatures, because that's going to affect who controls the redistricting. And that could have profound effects for the representation in Congress, and especially for representation in those same state legislatures moving ahead. With the federal government, and this will be the last thing I say, the federal government over the last 20 to 30 years has really become a lot less active in a lot of policy matters, and a lot more policy making has been pushed down to the state level, so that state governments are much more important now in determining policy in economies, social policies, et cetera. So so that's sort of the hidden set of elections, I think, that are very consequential. Plus the jungle primary. Every now and then, a lot of states have marijuana initiatives as well.
Okay, yes, that's right. It was in the last four years ago.
That's right. And that's, I always tell election officials, if they want to drive up turnout, they should put a marijuana initiative on the ballot, because that always gets about another 5% of the population to turn out to vote.
Okay. Well, great, Charles, this is really wonderful. And I don't know about the rest of our audience, but I could sit and listen to you for hours, and I'm sure you could speak about politics for hours. So we'll leave that to your next visit to Greece. That's the third time I've said it, which I think is good luck here. I'll take this opportunity first to thank once again my colleague Marina Haritopoulou up in the College Relations Office, who has been mastering all the technical side of the webinar. We have a request, Charles, for the slideshow. So if it's available publicly and you could send me a copy, I'll forward it to the audience member who's made that request. I'll just remind our audience that we hope, yes, once again, to do an event after the election, probably on foreign policy sorts of issues. And our co-host for that event will be Elia Meb. Look for that towards the end of November. We have scheduled or rescheduled an event which we postponed, Dukakis lecture in May of 2021 on the founding of the Turkish Republic. Rather interesting book by a colleague from Switzerland, which we are going to present to the public here in Thessaloniki. And we'll have several more events, hopefully in the spring, that we're able to hold publicly, where we have an audience face to face and we can mingle with you and keep you for as long as one wants to stay. So with that, I'm happy to thank once again our speaker, Charles Stewart, Professor of Political Science at MIT. Good luck. I think you're going to be busy for the next several weeks. And if you're on TV, send us the link and we'll watch you and cheer for you and give you the critique afterwards. Thanks to our audience for signing in, and good evening.